Touring coaches are something like long-haul airliners. Here, too, there is a nearly constant battle between passenger capacity and comfort. A bus can be made extremely comfortable, with plenty of personal space for passengers, but then it becomes less profitable because it cannot carry enough people. Or the opposite approach can be taken, by making the bus as large and high capacity as possible, while sacrificing passenger comfort, which in the end also leads to lower profits. At one point, the German company Neoplan decided that compromises were no longer necessary. That decision marked the beginning of some of the largest and most unusual touring coaches ever built. Neoplan's first step in this direction was not the Megaliner at all. This story had actually begun much earlier, back in 1974. At that time, Neoplan was far more than just another bus manufacturer. The company was setting trends and defining the direction of the global bus industry, and without exaggeration, was considered one of the leaders in its field. But for the head of the company, Gottlob Auwarter, even that was not enough. At some point, he became obsessed with the idea of creating a gigantic touring machine, unlike anything else in terms of both comfort and passenger capacity. Eventually, Gottlob came to the conclusion that they needed to build not just a double-decker bus, but an articulated double-decker bus. The engineers were tasked with developing a technology not for a one-off prototype, but for small-scale production of such vehicles. And despite how unrealistic the idea seemed, the project was eventually brought to completion. In 1975, at the International Motor Show in Frankfurt am Main, Neoplan presented its new giant. The Neoplan Jumbocruiser had actually been purchased by the travel company Globus Reisen, even before the show officially opened, which is why the bus already carried the branding of its new owner on display. Alongside Neoplan representatives, employees of Globus were also present at the stand, proudly showing off their new acquisition. The first Jumbo was based on production buses from two different Neoplan families, the three-axle double-decker Skyliner and the articulated single-decker Jetliner. In practice, a full semi-trailer section was attached to the Skyliner chassis through the articulated joint from the Jetliner. Access to that rear section was only possible through the upper deck because the engine and transmission were mounted behind the third axle on a special subframe at the rear of the lower level, completely blocking the passage. Power came from a 12-cylinder V-shaped Mercedes engine producing 440 horsepower at 2,400 revolutions per minute. Torque was sent to the drive axle through a 5-speed Allison automatic transmission with an integrated retarder. The second axle served as the driven axle. Interestingly, the air suspension on all 4 axles featured an automatic pressure redistribution system during cornering. Thanks to this, even such a giant maintained an almost perfectly upright position while maneuvering. The dimensions of the bus were truly enormous: 18 meters long, 4 meters tall, and 2.5 meters wide, with a total weight of 28 tons. Unsurprisingly, the turning radius of this colossus reached 12 meters. The Jumbo could carry 102 people on board, 3 of whom were crew members: the driver, a relief driver, and a tour guide. At the rear of the bus, there was a 10 cubic meter luggage compartment, a spacious wardrobe area, a restroom, a compact kitchen, and a sleeping compartment for the second driver. Passengers entered the bus through 3 doors with openings about 70 centimeters wide. At first glance, the Jumbocruiser seemed to solve the passenger capacity problem perfectly and appeared ideal for long-distance touring. But in reality, its size proved excessive for late 1970s Europe. On many European roads, not to mention the narrow cities of Italy and France, operating the Jumbo created constant problems. Full-scale serial production was never truly possible. In total, only 11 Jumbocruisers were built, and the last one was completed as late as 1991. Neoplan had no intention of abandoning the idea of ultra-high-capacity buses. The company drew the right conclusions from the failure of the Jumbo because, aside from its enormous size, the bus itself had also been an engineering extreme in almost every possible way, from its articulated design to the complexity of servicing it. While developing a new bus, Neoplan attempted to realize the same idea again, but this time in a more practical and traditional form. Especially since the foundation for such a vehicle already essentially existed within the company. While European regulations limited bus length to 12 meters, Neoplan had already built a 15-meter, four-axle version of its double-decker Skyliner back in 1975 for a customer in Chile. These buses proved fairly successful, and throughout the 1970s and 1980s were sold not only in South America but also in Saudi Arabia, Libya, Turkey, and other regions with less restrictive size regulations. But more than anything, the company wanted to bring such vehicles to the European market, which was significantly larger and far more profitable. That only happened in 1990, when Neoplan introduced the four-axle Megaliner, which was the same 15 meters long. The Megaliner became part of the company's larger strategy to change European bus length regulations. Neoplan actively promoted the idea of 15-meter touring coaches, attempting to convince German and European regulators that vehicles of this size could operate safely. To achieve this, the company offered buses to operators on favorable terms and secured special permits for their operation. This allowed carriers to use the Megaliner on real routes, while Neoplan itself could demonstrate that even such a large bus was capable of operating safely on European roads. At the same time, the company participated in the lengthy approval process for new EU regulations, which eventually did allow the operation of 15-meter buses. As is often the case in Europe, changing the regulations took several years. But in 1993, Germany, followed by other EU countries, finally approved the operation of 15-meter touring buses, provided they met a number of technical requirements, including the use of additional steering axles to improve maneuverability and safety. The Megaliner stood nearly 4 meters tall and 2.5 meters wide. The standard configuration included 50 passenger seats on the upper deck and 40 on the lower deck, although customers could, of course, choose other interior layouts depending on their needs. The buses were most commonly powered by massive Mercedes-Benz OM 442 V8 diesel engines with a displacement of 15.1 liters, producing up to 525 horsepower and around 1,930 newton-meters of torque. MAN and Scania engines were also available. These were usually paired with an 8-speed ZF manual transmission. Unlike the Jumbo, the Megaliner became a real commercial product that generated enormous interest from many potential operators. Its sales were never truly massively, especially considering the bus's unusual nature and high price, although that did not surprise anyone. From the very beginning, Neoplan understood perfectly well that the Megaliner was a niche vehicle, and definitely not for everyone. Its customers included large travel companies and European operators that needed maximum passenger capacity. At the same time, the level of passenger comfort could hardly be described as anything other than luxurious. Passengers had access to a kitchen area, refrigerator, coffee machine, televisions, air conditioning, a full restroom, and that was far from the complete list. Moreover, customers could equip the Megaliner with almost any option available on the market at the time. On some buses, for example, the lower deck featured a bar and lounge area instead of part of the passenger seating section. The main customers for the Megaliner were German and some other Western European companies. But perhaps the most interesting story is connected to Japan. Japanese operators were attracted to the Megaliner primarily because of its capacity. In a country with extremely high population density and expensive driver labor, transport companies were obsessed with maximizing passenger capacity. A perfect example of this was the Boeing 747, which in Japan was actively used on domestic routes, something that looked completely insane to most other countries. Japanese jumbo jets usually did not have first-class cabins. Instead, they were configured with extremely dense economy-class seating. On average, these aircraft carried around 550 passengers, while some versions could take on board as many as 600 people. In many ways, these Boeings effectively served as airborne buses for Japan's enormous domestic passenger traffic. The Megaliner served essentially the same purpose on the ground, only on a much smaller scale. Megaliners mainly operated on the same routes as the Boeings, Tokyo to Osaka and Tokyo to Fukuoka. Neoplan never published exact sales figures for the Megaliner in Japan, but according to various sources, around 20 buses were delivered there, Unfortunately, the fate of these vehicles in Japan was not particularly good. In 2008 and 2009, two serious Megaliner fires occurred during active service. In both cases, there were no casualties or injuries, but the buses were almost completely destroyed by fire. After the second incident, Japanese operators effectively ended the use of the remaining Megaliners. In Europe, Neoplan also attempted to adapt the Megaliner for regular passenger transport. But unlike the Japanese versions, the Neoplan Mega Shuttle was designed specifically for urban service. The goal was simple and obvious: carry the maximum possible number of passengers in a single trip, something especially important during rush hour. However, the Mega Shuttle never generated much enthusiasm. Despite its obvious advantages in passenger capacity, problems such as high cost, engineering complexity, and expensive maintenance quickly outweighed all of its benefits. In the end, only a small number of Mega Shuttles were sold to 3 German cities, after which the model was fairly quickly removed from the Neoplan lineup. For the Megaliner itself, the stable situation it had enjoyed through most of the 1990s began to change with the arrival of the new millennium and new European bus regulations. Several bus manufacturers managed to secure EU approval for 14-meter buses with a single front axle, provided they complied with axle load regulations. And a bus with one front axle was significantly simpler, cheaper, and more economical to operate than the complex 4-axle Megaliner. At the same time, the difference in length was only 1 meter, which practically eliminated the Megaliner's main advantage. The already limited demand for the Megaliner effectively collapsed after that. As a result, Neoplan stopped accepting new Megaliner orders in 2000. Although according to official company data, the final Megaliner was not assembled until 2003. In 2001, Neoplan became part of MAN, and although the company survived and continues to exist to this day, it still lost part of its uniqueness. Engineering boldness was replaced by rationality, and daring experiments gave way to careful calculation. Although perhaps that is exactly what allowed the company to survive in the end. Today, the largest bus in Neoplan's lineup is the 14-meter Starliner, which essentially inherited the idea behind the Megaliner, only in a far more traditional and rational form.